Welcome. This is an Interpreter Roundtable. Book of Mormon Lesson 14 is the specific lesson we cover today. The title is For a Wise Purpose. And the specific purpose of this lesson, according to the manual, is to emphasize that the Scriptures have been prepared and preserved to guide us and direct us. This series of short little books that we cover today start with Enos, go through Jarom, Omni, and the Words of Mormon, and they have some absolutely fascinating material. Before we started, we were talking about the sort of eclectic group of information here, and it's just remarkable. To start us off, let me also mention our other participants. Bruce Webster, Shon Hopkin. My name's Martin Tanner, and let's start off with an introduction by Bruce. Go ahead.
Okay, this lesson is going to cover the last of what's on the so-called small plates of Nephi, as distinguished from this isn't Mormon's abridgment. This is still original writing, much as it was with 1st and 2nd Nephi and Jacob. But what's interesting here is you've got a series of very small books that cover about 300 to 400 years of history, and sometimes we lose sight of that. It's going to pick up again just about a century and a half before before the birth of Christ. So these plates, and I know Shon has some comments to make here. They're remarkably candid. They're quite varied as far as the number of people who are commenting on it, and you see, you know, there's an old joke about, you know, families that have multiple children. The first baby book is all filled out and everything is there, and the second one is, you know, filled up but not as much, and then the third one has got a bunch of stuff stuck in it, and the fourth and so on are still in their wrappers. You sort of get that effect here. You have Nephi and Jacob who do a lot of writing. You know, Enos has this wonderful conversion story, and then it's people to a certain extent going through the motions. You know, this is our family tradition. I've got to write something. I'm going to hand this off to my son or to my brother or whatever. And you get these little vignettes which are just delightful, as we'll see in some of these. So this is good stuff, and this is connecting tissue to get us into Mosiah. As the title says, for a wise purpose. These plates were preserved, and you know, Mormon received the prompting to include these small plates precisely to because the Lord knew what was going to happen with Martin Harris, 116 pages all the way back then. So, having said that, I'll hand it off to Martin and Shon.
So you want me to say something here
Please,
about?
go ahead.
So these voices. I was working on a project with a few colleagues that we entitled "The Voices of the Book of Mormon," and the goal was to identify when different voices were speaking, or writing, or being quoted, and sort of separate those out. We ended up with a list of 153 different voices in the Book of Mormon. We separated those out, and that made it really fun because you could do things with databases where you could search for word uses amongst the different voices. But this is one of those rapid fire. You hear different people speaking and talking differently and representing themselves differently. There's a view amongst some, when you compare the Book of Mormon to biblical literature, that the Book of Mormon characters sort of cookie cutter, and I think that comes because of the strong editing hands of Nephi and Mormon, where they are presenting a story, they're editing the story, they're telling you without delving into all of maybe the dirty details that sometimes we get in the book of Genesis, how God's plan and how this works. And so this is really fun here to get real human beings, of course Nephi and Mormon were as well, but real human beings being honest about their strengths and their weaknesses. And this is a really nice attribute of Book of Mormon voices, authors, speakers, that they try to be honest. And Mormon and Nephi do as well. Moroni, of course, famously says, hey, I've got weaknesses, and there's going to be weaknesses, and if so, they're the weaknesses of men. And this is a very upfront and open way of looking at Scripture that some in the Christian world would be uncomfortable seeing the Bible this way. I don't think I'm open enough to see weaknesses there. Book of Mormon authors prepare us for weaknesses. And then to Bruce's point, you got one that says, I'm a wicked man. Well, what's he doing writing in the scriptures? It's really nice, actually. It's nuanced. There's some complexity there, and I appreciate that nuance of voices. So,
thank you. Great comments. And another comment about the context and the order of the Book of Mormon. The Words of Mormon, which is the last of our books that we cover today, actually ends the translation process of the Book of Mormon. Now, somebody's scratching their heads and thinking, this Martin guy, he's off his rocker. But let me explain it, and it'll become clear here. When the 116 pages were lost, they were, of course, the Book of Lehi. And after the Book of Lehi was lost, the translation process continued on. And then, after the Book of Mormon was in effect completed, the beginning was retranslated. And so what happens is that after the 116 pages were lost, the Book of Mosiah was translated. And you go through the end of the Book of Mormon, and then the translation came back to the beginning. And how do we know that that's the way it all worked out? Well, there are a number of different ways. One is that originally in the printer's manuscript, the Book of Mosiah wasn't called the Book of Mosiah. It was chapter 3, presumably chapter 3 of the Book of Lehi. And so what happened was that as the process continued on, and then Joseph Smith came back and translated the beginning, the Words of Mormon were completed, and it wasn't chapter 2. And so you had to have a different title for the Book of Mosiah, and chapter 3 was then crossed out, and the title was changed to be the Book of Mosiah. Now, someone else might also say, well, wait a minute, this is page 145, and this is typeset. How is it that you could have 145 pages typeset in the Book of Mormon from just 116 replacement pages, approximately, or replacement for the original 116 pages? And the answer to that is that the kind of paper that the translation was written upon was called foolscap, and it was enormous paper. It was about twice the size of our 8.5 by 11 pages, and so there was a tremendous amount of information that was jam-packed on each one of these original manuscript pages for the Book of Mormon. I will, in fairness, add that there are a number of different theories about this. Some people think that Joseph Smith went back to the very beginning and started translating what is now First Nephi and ended at the very end, but it seems to most LDS scholars, and I am persuaded that most of the questions about the translation process are answered if the assumption is made that the Book of Mosiah was where, after the 116 pages were lost, that the translation process continued, and then after our Book of Ether and Moroni were completed, then Joseph Smith went back and completed the first portion of the Book of Mormon through the Words of Mormon, which we are covering today. And with that, let's get right into the text of our lesson today, the Book of Enos, which is absolutely fabulous.
Yeah. Let me just add one thing. I'll note that Royal Skousen, who's been doing the critical text, thinks that chapter 3 was chapter 3 of Mosiah. In other words, what we lost was the Book of Lehi plus the first 2 chapters of Mosiah. So there are some different discussions as to what the chapter 3 referred to. But go ahead.
Along those lines, there are some unique things at the beginning of the Book of Mosiah, right? There's no introductory. It's the only book really that doesn't have an introductory heading like the others. That you jump right into the middle of the story. Sorry, I interrupted, Bruce. I've got one other thing I'd like to say before we jump into the text of Enos, if that's all right.
Sure.
So, two things to trace through these books that it's fun to be aware of and stay aware of is this growing sense of urgency with what appears to be a limited amount of space. And so you see it's shrinking and shrinking, but it's not just a limited space. The other thing that they seem to be sensitive to is you can track a commission given of what to write on these plates that is passed down and seems to be communicated very effectively from generation to generation. You can see it starting in Jacob 1, where Nephi gave me a commandment, Jacob says, concerning these plates, not to touch, save it were lightly, concerning the history. And then the other thing he says is, this is verse 4, I should engraven the heads of great prophesying upon these plates and touch upon them as much as were possible for Christ's sake. And so you've got a very limited view of what can be put on these plates, and I think that's why you get later people maybe with a little less inspiration and the gift of revelation a little less than Nephi and Jacob saying, I don't really have anything to add as far as those main spiritual points, the essence of the message here that was handed down from Nephi. And so you can track both that commission, and Malachi, of course, finishes this up very nicely with one of the beautiful statements about relying upon Christ in the Book of Mormon, and then it's done. But tracking that commission and sort of this urgency that limits the words as you move towards the end of this here.
And Bruce, was there something else you wanted to cover there that we missed? The Book of Enos, the actual content is some of the most exquisite scripture that we have in the Book of Mormon, and it is sort of a blueprint for all of us about how we might be able to approach God while we are in a sinful state. There's this tension in most Christian traditions and Jewish traditions of the unworthiness of people to come before God and to pray. And Jesus addressed this a little bit in the in some of his sermons, talking about how people should approach God even when they were imperfect. He talked about how people who were sinful were more justified in approaching God than those who would pray out loud and say how wonderful they were, for example. A number of different examples of that in Scripture. But this is so wonderful because here we have in the Book of Enos an entire book devoted to the idea that someone who hungers for remission of sins, someone who sees their own sinfulness, can approach God and be forgiven. And this is just a wonderful blueprint. I just absolutely love it. And it talks about the sincerity and the dedication and the stick-to-itiveness, if I can use that phrase, the endurance that Enos used when he came before God. This is not someone who prayed for and expected some instant response to his prayer, but it talks about him hungering and wrestling with God. And the text shows us that it took some great length of time for this to be a responded to prayer in the way that Enos had hoped for, and it's just wonderful. Other comments about Enos?
It's just to echo, it's an exquisite book. I get the impression, the more I look at it, I think Enos wrote this or composed this pretty much as a single unit. It's not an ongoing chronicle. I think this is his reflection at the end of his life, sort of his passing, bearing his testimony to his descendants. You know, why I believe. You know, here's the wrestling I had. Here's what I did. Here's why I did it. And it's just it's a devotional type scripture. It's a sort of thing you read to be inspired to repent and take stock of your life. And it shows, you know, there's nothing to indicate that that he is in any way a wicked man, but he talks about wrestling for remission of his sins, and then, you know, pleading for his brethren the Nephites, then pleading for the Lamanites, and following it up with, you know, talking about, you know, we tried really hard to reach out to the Lamanites, and they would have none of it. And he said, and frankly, the Nephites, if it weren't for all the prophets, would be going to hell in a handbasket. You know, you see here that the troubles that were set forth in Jacob continue here. That there are real issues with the Nephite culture, those that are called Nephites, as we've discussed in previous lessons, and we're going to trace this over the next couple of books until we get yet another Exodus finally in the book of Omni, but I don't want to get ahead of myself there.
So I'll add a few additional thoughts. I appreciated Bruce referring to that sort of the beginnings of personal concern. You've got to make sure you're right before the Lord, and then watching how those concerns spread to his family, the Nephites, and then more to the world. Joseph Smith talks about one, I'm going to misquote him pretty badly here, but one who is inspired by God isn't content to just bless his family alone, but begins to desire to bless the whole world. And you see Enos is spreading concerns, his charity, the expansion of his charity here, as he becomes converted to the Lord. That personal conversion springboards charity in his life, so to speak. Some textual things that are really beautiful. The wrestle, he talks about this wrestle, and what a wonderful English word that is. And then the phrase, which I had, the wrestle which I had, this is verse 2, before God. So it's not with God. He's not wrestling with God to forgive him of his sins. He's wrestling in front of God, so to speak. And so then you have to ask yourself who he's wrestling with. We would assume that's with his own doubts, with his own natural man propensities, with his own feelings of inadequacy, and that speaks to a lot of us, I think, in our insecurities and our desires for the Lord. So, I mean, some other things he says beautifully here. My soul hungered. There just is has been said, this devotional aspect of it that is very descriptive. And I think one last thing I'll just mention briefly is this moment in verses 5 through 6, when the voice comes and says, thy sins are forgiven thee, thou shalt be blessed. His guilt isn't swept away until he believes the voice. He believes, well, God can't lie, therefore my guilt is swept away. And so, fascinating. That's a pretty nuanced view of guilt and of repentance and forgiveness, that our faith, we impose some of this upon ourselves, or we accept it, and then our faith is necessary for it to be swept away. It's not just God removing the guilt from our hearts, it's us believing that God is able to do so, and that belief then finishes that process, so to speak, or allows that process to take full root in us. So some really beautiful philosophical, theological concepts here, I think.
Spectacular, well said. Two quick comments. Shon's done a very nice job of saying that this was a wrestle before God. This is not like Jacob literally wrestling with God, as we find at the end of Genesis. This is something that shouldn't be confused with that. This is somebody's personal struggles with their status before God might be another way of conveying the information here. Something that we can all relate to, whereas few of us can, probably none of us can actually relate to actually wrestling directly with God. Another quick comment, this is something that may or may not come up, is that in verse 21 you have a reference to horses. And this is one of about 4 or so references to horses in the Book of Mormon, and people have written criticisms about the Book of Mormon in reference to horses for a long, long, long time. Suffice it to say that there are non-LDS sources that would acknowledge that there are horses in the Book of Mormon. At one point I spent a great deal of time trying to assemble a number of these. One place where you might go if you have concerns in that area is a book that was published actually quite some time ago now by Professor John L. Sorensen of Brigham Young University, called An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon, in which he talks about what these references to horses may or may not mean. So with that, I think we can wrap up the Book of Enos, but mention here that there are references to tilling the ground, which shows that the Nephites were very established by this point. They were raising crops, fruit, grains, they had flocks, they had cattle, and of course you have here the ongoing distinction between the different groups, which we would see as more of a religious distinction between the Lamanites and the Nephites, but political as well. And another emphasis here that we find in Enos is the great emphasis on preserving records. We see that here and over and over and over again in the Book of Mormon. And without that emphasis in our church and with the Jews and the Dead Sea Scrolls community and others, much of world history would not be available to us. So the whole idea of records is a wonderful one, and it's mentioned here in Enos. Any other thoughts about Enos, please?
Yeah, one last brief thought. I see another example of what I read anyway as humanness, although others might read this differently, in verse 20, talking about the Lamanites in terms that I think we would consider racist today. I don't think I would talk about another people and generalize them in the way that Enos is doing it here. Their hatred was fixed, their evil nature. They became wild, ferocious, bloodthirsty. They're using different tools. They're hunters rather than farmers. And there's these community divisions that actually, to me, make Enos a very real voice and actually situate him pretty well in an ancient world, right? We don't do this much today, but anciently, this is how your people was the repository of the true religious concepts, and so there were distinguishers, and you looked at the other, and you were very cautious of the other because they would pull you away from a true worship and a worship of the true God. And I see these things being very biblically rooted or anciently rooted in pretty fascinating ways. So,
Bruce.
Yeah, one last point, and I don't want to take too much time with this. It's just it's the sort of thing some people either stumble over or harp on. When you get to verse 125, chapter 1, verse 25 of Enos, it says it's been 179 years have passed away from the time our father left Jerusalem. Well, this means, roughly speaking, the lives of Jacob and Enos spanned about 175 years. This isn't impossible, but it's highly unusual, and I did some analysis of some potential things. A close reading, whereas Jacob makes reference to Enos, Enos never makes reference to his father by name. And there's a possibility that the Enos who writes the Book of Enos is actually Jacob's grandson, or a similar second-generation descendant as opposed to having an unbroken chain there. That the Enos, the son of Jacob, died before he ever got a chance to write anything. As I said, it appears that this Enos was writing at the end of his life. It is possible that Jacob actually fathered a son in his very old age. You were talking in his 80s. It's possible also that Enos is adopted or is non-lineal. He's a grandson or grandnephew. The last thing to keep in mind, however, is that when one starts to struggle and say, well, that can't possibly be, John Tyler, the 10th President of the United States, has 2 living grandsons today. Now recognize that John Tyler was born in 1790, and he has 2 grandsons alive today, and they are actual grandsons. John Tyler remarried late in his life. At age 63, he had a son, Lyon Tyler, and Lyon Tyler at age 75 had a son, Harrison, who's about 80 and still alive. Actually, be about 88 now. So the basic point is there are a number of potential explanations for the gap there. There's nothing to be terribly concerned about, don't let anyone say, oh, clearly Joseph was making a mistake here. No, there are actually a number of different explanations here, all of which we can deal with. So that's the last I have to say on Enos.
Perfect. Excellent. Thank you. Well said. Jarom is a fascinating book. It talks about Nephites keeping the law of Moses. It has a reference in it to the coming of Christ, and it talks about in verse 5 to dovetail with the whole issue of the time period here. 200 years had passed away, and the people of Nephi had waxed strong. So here's a reference to the Nephites doing really, really, really well. And it's fascinating because right after, in verse 5, it talks about how well they were doing in the land. It says they observed to keep the law of Moses and the Sabbath day holy unto the Lord. They profaned not, neither did they blaspheme. And the laws of the land were exceedingly strict. So the implication here is these were good people. They kept the laws, they kept the commandments to the best of their knowledge and the best of their ability. And just like the Book of Mormon does in so many other places, it ties prosperity to being good. Not necessarily prosperity in the sense of being rich or being wealthy, but in that great phrase about which we won't talk about too much, of having sufficient for your needs. You have enough. And I think that's a great reference there. And then it goes on to talk about the dichotomy between the Nephites and the Lamanites, and how in verse 6 they were scattered upon much of the face of the land, and they loved murder, and they would drink the blood of beasts, which is pretty dramatic. Some people have talked about how, oh, that's not too, like, who drinks the blood of beasts? Well, the Maasai warriors in Africa did that, a number of different groups. That this is something that historically has happened. We also have ideas here about fortified cities in verse 7, and other references here to wars and things that would not have been intuitive to Joseph Smith, and yet have been found in archaeological efforts over the past 150 years or so. Joseph Smith would not have known about Native American fortified cities. If he were just coming up with this record, that's not something that he would have written in here if he were trying to make it look realistically at all. So For me, this is something that he has in here that would not have been intuitive, that turns out to be absolutely correct, and another bullseye, as Dan Peterson said once quite a while ago in a short little piece, one of Joseph Smith's greatest hits, which I always kind of liked. Other comments about the book of Jarom?
Just two things. First, unlike Enos, which has a feeling of having been composed as a whole, it's clear that Jarom is sort of starting and stopping on his writing. There's at least two divisions, because he mentions two different dates, possibly three. In other words, I think the verse 5 may actually start a new entry. So he writes a few words and he says, okay, now it's been 200 years, and then in 13 it says now 238 years have passed away, and I'm finishing these up. The other thing is that it's good to keep in mind, and this gets back to an issue that I know has come up. In fact, Martin, I think you've raised this in some of the previous Book of Mormon roundtables. It's good to keep in mind that the Nephites' characterization of the Lamanites isn't necessarily accurate. And to a certain extent in Jacob, though Jacob actually uses the Lamanites as a good example to the Nephites, but in these books, it's there is a very classic, and again, we're talking about 2,500 years ago, demonizing the opposing culture as the other. And so, oh, they're savages. They wear loincloths. They drink the blood of beasts. And the interesting thing is when we actually finally meet the Lamanites, in to a certain extent in Mosiah, and then later on to much greater extent in Alma, they certainly have some classic 100-year ago, cultural behaviors, but they're not quite the savages running around drinking blood and wearing loincloths that you get the sense of through this. The other thing is that a few commentators have pointed out that this emphasis about them drinking the blood of beasts comes up, I believe, a couple times, and the suggestion is this is used in direct contradistinction to keeping the law of Moses. Basically, the Lamanites were ritually unclean. They were eating things that are prohibited by the law of Moses. And this goes along with the general theme that Nephi laid out, that the Lamanites were not worthy heirs to Lehi, to the temple, to the law of Moses, and so on and so forth. So those are probably my two big comments there for Jarom.
Anything else for Jarom? Okay. Let's move on to the book of Omni or Omni, depending on whether you're tomato or tomato here. This is one of the most realistic, to my mind, and kind of fun to read books in the Book of Mormon, and it's great. You have Omni or Omni talking about himself as being a wicked man, which he seems to do in a very humble way in verse 2. At least that's the way I seemed to take it. He's not proud of what he's done, because he ends verse 2 as saying, I haven't kept the commandments as I ought to have done. He quickly adds that, and then he goes on and talks about very little. This is a commandment, and so he does it and he writes, but he just doesn't say very much. And then you have Amron or however you would like to pronounce it, who takes over the record, and then my personal favorite guy in verse 9, Shemish, who basically says, and I won't read the whole verse, but he basically says, "Gee, I write a few words, and I'm writing them, and I'm done." It's kind of, he just, there is really nothing of substance, but he actually, I guess, kind of thinks he did his duty there.
He basically uses a circumlocution.
Yes.
Yeah. I've seen a few people who had journal entries because they were told to write the journal entries that looked about like this. At any rate, these just ring true to me because they speak to the wide variety of people who we find in this world and give us, I think, a stark contrast in who we might choose to be or who we might choose not to be. I only had two other quick comments about the book of Omni, which I find absolutely fascinating. One of those is in verse 20, where it talks about a large stone being found with engravings on it. So this isn't plates, this is a large stone, and the stone was brought with engravings, and they had an account of Coriantumr. And then we have this fascinating reference here which shows a huge cultural shift from the way the Jews would have written this originally in Jerusalem had they remained there, because the end of verse 21 talks about the space of 9 moons. It's not likely that 9 moons would have been the way something would have been described had Lehi and his party not come over here. So this 9 moons reference and large stone are fascinating because they show different ways of doing things that had come about over the great time period that had lapsed. Much more to say here, which I'll leave to these other two fine gentlemen. Who would like to go next?
Shon?
Shon.
Well, so actually, Bruce, if you want, why don't you let's talk a little bit about the Exodus theme here, and maybe I'll tag on, or maybe you'll say everything that needs to be said.
Okay. We have this as we've been tracking through here. You see the sort of up and down, hot and cold pattern, which is pervasive, frankly, throughout all the scriptures. And it reaches a point where you have Messiah, and it's unclear who Messiah is. I mean, what role he actually has. He leads a group of people very much like Lehi, away from the land of Nephi and through the wilderness and down the river valley, and discovers or arrives at, they may have already had contact with it, the city of Zarahemla. We could discuss at great length here that the fact you've got the Zarahemla culture. These are the so-called Mulekites. The term Mulekite is never used in the Book of Mormon. These are the people who said they came over from Jerusalem at the time of Jerusalem's destruction as well, but had lost their language, had forgotten their God. They apparently had become, aside from their traditions and their genealogy, become culturally very assimilated. And Messiah, the stranger, is made king over them. This is actually, in my opinion, this lays the groundwork for much of what we get between now and the coming of Christ, with the constant wars, because it is most of the wars that we see are not actually wars between the Nephites and Lamanites. They're wars between two groups in Zarahemla, the group that wants to restore kingship and those belonging to the Church of God. And usually the ones who want to restore the kingship are the ones going up and either stirring up the Lamanites to anger, or they actually take over the Lamanite government. There's some great stuff, but that's way ahead. So this is laying the groundwork. Mosiah comes down. This is very much another Exodus theme. They're banished. They're carried through the wilderness. They end up making Mosiah king. Mosiah is appointed to be their king, and the people of Zarahemla and of Mosiah did unite together. And Amalekite was born in the days of Messiah, has lived to see his death, sees Benjamin is reigning in his stead, and sees problems. And with this, the passing on of the plates dies out. We already had a lateral shift where who was it? Amram gave the plates to his brother Chemish. Chemish gives it to his son Abinadab, and Abinadab gives it to his son Amaleki. And Amaleki doesn't have anyone to give him to. His brother is part of the group, and you know, the narrative in the Book of Mormon is so complex. Talks about this group going back to try and reclaim the land of Nephi, contention in the wilderness. They come back, and they go off again. His brother goes with him. He says, I don't have anyone to give the plates to, so I'm just going to hand these over to King Benjamin. And that's the end of the small plates of Nephi. This is the very end of them. That's the last thing that's written. And you know, again, as Martin has said, there is such a human quality to this book. It's for the most part relatively ordinary people writing unvarnished thoughts briefly, and it covers about 200 years in 4 generations. So that's this is always one of my favorite. Has always been one of my favorite books in the Book of Mormon, just because it really is sort of behind the scenes. No editing, no careful composition, no, you know, Nephi doesn't start his plates till 30 years after they leave Jerusalem, but this is all pretty much people saying, yeah, I got to write something here. Here's what's going on. Anyway, over to you, Shon.
Well, so following along that Exodus theme, I think it sets up a whole lot of issues. Bruce has talked about the challenge between the Mulekites or the Zarahemlites and the Nephites that seems to undergird lots of the social conflict. And maybe one of the reasons that you move from a judgeship, from a kingship to a judgeship, there's all kinds of things going on. This probably is a subtext for. The other theme that this allows, and you have to read between the lines, and you'll, as you listen to me express this, you have to decide if you agree as you think about the Book of Mormon, is that Zeniff and others, including kingmen and those who are trying to go back to the Lamanites and take over rule there, may believe that they are the righteous ones who are returning to the land. They're the ones who've been guided back by the hand of God, and this seems to play out well in Noah's, the wicked King Noah's self-view, that Abinadi comes along and says they're wicked, and they're thinking, now hold on, we're the ones who have returned, and look around you, we're prospering, and the promise is if you're obedient, you prosper in the land. Here we are prospering in the land, and those other guys are the ones that stayed behind. And so there's some alternate theologies and viewpoints of the return that may creep in here. The Nephites never really legitimately return anywhere throughout the entire Book of Mormon. It's really, there's a constant scattering and dissemination going on, and the gathering is difficult to see. They have to look forward to the last days for that. And people who are trying to take it upon themselves to return not under God's direction, they end up failing, being prideful, and then failing in the end. So there's some pretty nuanced concepts and interplay of ideas going on here. One last thought. I wish we had more from, we've got quite a bit, but I wish we had more from Amaleki. What a writer he is. Mm-hmm. This statement, this witness of Christ that he gives at the end just rings powerful. It's one of the best statements anywhere in the Book of Mormon. I would that you should, this is verse 26, come unto Christ, who is the Holy One of Israel, partake of his salvation, the power of his redemption. Yea, come unto him and offer your whole souls as an offering unto him. Continue in fasting and prayer, endure to the end. As the Lord liveth, ye will be saved. This is beautiful, and this may be just me, but I hear Moroni. I wonder if Amaleki influences final statements by Moroni at some point. I don't know, but it's beautiful.
It absolutely is. That's just wonderful, wonderful statement. Our last book of our lesson today is the Words of Mormon, and this is really a description of Mormons, a bridging of the history of the plates of Nephi. And we have this sense of a great period of time and his lamenting. Instead of talking about the present, he is looking back a great deal. Verse 1 talks about Mormon witnessing almost all the destruction of his people. He's looking back and describing these horrible events that he's seen. And then he, in verse 2, talks about the many 100 years after the coming of Christ. So again, he is looking back and talking about the great time period that has now elapsed, hundreds of years since the time of Christ. He delivers the records to the hands of his son, and he supposes, and this is in verse 2, that his son will witness the entire destruction of his people. So as he writes, he has witnessed the death of almost all of his people, and he is anticipating that his son will see the obliteration of his people. Not much hope described there. It's very, very dramatic, and every time I read this, I'm reminded of the description towards the end of the New Testament, where you just don't see great hope about the continuation of the New Testament church. You have this great hope for individuals who will follow Christ, but not for the continuation of the church itself. And here in the Words of Mormon, you have a similar kind of a comment. He, of course, has great hope for those who have lived a righteous life, but as far as hope for the continuation of his people, you don't find it. As a matter of fact, he specifically says the opposite. And so here you have this sad, remorseful description at the beginning, and then he goes on and talks about, in verse 7, a wise purpose for all these revelations, which he really doesn't know completely. He just knows there's a wise purpose. And he, in verse 8, prays to God concerning his brethren. These would be the Lamanites, that they might become a delightsome people. He's hoping that even though his people are going to have oblivion come very, very soon, he's hoping that there might be some good. And then he proceeds to finish out his record in verse 9. That's the description there. And so from there he has other descriptions about false Christs who have come, false prophets who have come in verses 15 and 16. And then you have at the end some great words of hope about King Benjamin and his authority and the great words that he uses. And when you read this, it sort of shifts the feeling of the Book of Mormon from the Book of Omni to something very serious and very sobering. Other comments about Omni, I'll pass it off to the Words of Mormon. I'll pass it off to whoever else would like to comment. Bruce?
My only comment is there's a real melancholy about some of Mormon's and Moroni's writing. And you see some of that here, where Mormon is persevering in the face of destruction. It's interesting, verse 3, and of course the title of this lesson is For a Wise Purpose. It appears that Mormon is somehow aware of these records, but didn't have them specifically at hand. He said, I got this far, and he says, I remembered these other records, and I went searching for them. and I'm going to add these to my record as well, so that you have them. It's unclear if he actually transcribed the small plates of Nephi onto his own plates, or if he simply literally stuck them at the end. I don't know one way or the other, but it's, once again, I've been in the mornings off and on rereading An Approach to the Book of Mormon, which is Hugh Nibley's. He did the Melchizedek Priesthood Study Guide for 1957. And one of the chapters I just finished, Nibley ends saying, in essence, and it echoes how I feel, he basically says, I have no patience who think that the Book of Mormon was written by a clever but uneducated farm boy. The narrative and the document is far too complex and consistent. As you know, I've written some nonfiction books. I have some novels I'm writing or supposed to be writing, and it's terribly difficult to put together a consistent timeline and narrative. And in the Book of Mormon, particularly through here, starting with the Words of Mormon and then through Mosiah and Alma, you have this constant shifting of context. You have looping back. You have changing chronologies. You have different documents being brought in, and so on, and it all hangs together. It's all consistent. It is a powerful witness. My witness of the Book of Mormon is a spiritual witness, but it is a powerful witness, and something that people will have to answer for who reject the Book of Mormon without giving it due consideration as to its actual complexity and the consistency it maintains in that complexity in terms of the narrative. You have, we mentioned for the Book of Omni that it's setting up what will be a section in the Book of Mosiah, and you have here the tying this together to the Book of Mosiah as well. And Mormon was really brilliant, and it took him, I think, probably the better part of a decade to put together the Book of Mormon, sitting and working with plates and getting his narrative together. And towards the, as he gets to a certain point here, he remembers the small plates, or they're somehow, made known to him, and he goes and gets them, says, I'm going to include these because they've got some great prophecies which have been fulfilled, and we want them. So, anyway, that's my 2 cents on Words of Mormon.
Shon, other comments?
Yes, 2 thoughts. The way I read this, and there are different ways of reading this, but the way I read this, what Mormon is saying, he says he finds these, or he locates them, and then he loves what's on them. I sense he's changed by what he reads. That it shifts his goals, and I could be wrong there, but I suspect that the part of his record that we have is stronger as far as the prophecies of Christ go than the 116 lost pages. And I interpret verse 5 that way. He's just finished saying how pleasing the prophecies of the coming of Christ are, and then he says, wherefore I chose these things to finish my record upon them. There's different ways to read that, but I read that I chose these topics, and I finished my record focusing on them. And I'm sure he started his record that way, but I think my sense is he's deeply impacted by what he's read here.
There's actually a good article several years ago in Journal of Book of Mormon Studies that said that, I forget the author's name offhand, but basically his argument was that Mormon very deliberately patterned his narrative after Nephi.
Yeah.
So I think your observation is spot on, that the Mormon was in fact influenced in how he finished the remainder of his record by what he read on the small plates.
Which is then fun to see the impact that Nephi has on all of these descendants, all the way down to the end. Now, one last thought. Bruce talked about this sense of mourning, this sadness that you get from Mormon and Moroni. I cannot remember who I heard this from, and so I won't be able to properly cite the person that influenced me. But someone said there are basically three types of stories. You have whole stories, WHOLE, broken stories, and bent stories. And so whole stories they present good as good and evil as evil, and good wins in the end. Broken stories, good is presented as good, evil is evil, and evil wins in the end. They're tragedies, but you learn truths from the tragedies. And then bent stories twist it all around, and those are the dangerous stories because they present good as evil and evil as good, and it's very difficult to learn true messages from bent stories. As I thought about Latter-day Saint views of Scripture, I thought how beautiful it is to recognize that the Book of Mormon is a broken story. The Old Testament, it's broken. It's a tragedy. We are learning truths from a very tragic tale. The New Testament, our reading of the New Testament with all of the warnings of apostasy and the martyrdom of the apostles, this is a broken story, teaching powerful truths as a tragedy. Shakespeare would have liked this. And the Book of Mormon, a broken tale here, a very tragic story. And then these Book of Mormon authors looking forward finally to the whole story that resumes with the restoration of the gospel. This is their hope for a happy conclusion, and that this is the story that's being told in the Doctrine and Covenants and the restoration of the gospel, the story where finally those wrongs will be turned aright and God will return and reign over the earth. And it's fun to see, even though it's a broken story, they gain great hope and strength from what they see coming in the future, and they speak to us very personally and very directly, Mormon and Nephi, Moroni in particular. So
we'd like to thank all of you who are watching for taking a look at this roundtable, and hopefully many, many others as well. Thank you, Bruce, for joining us today, and Shon for joining us today. My name is Martin. Hope you'll join us for other roundtables in the future, and check out other wonderful things on Mormon Interpreter website.